Good afternoon, and welcome to Summer Haven, Jews and the Catskills During and After the Holocaust, hosted by the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society. My name is Rachel King. I'm the director of the center, and I will be your moderator today. The Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center is a destination for exploring and preserving the history of Jewish families and institutions in New England and beyond. We are an archive, educational center, and family history resource located at New England Historic Genealogical Society, America's founding genealogical organization. Today we will hear from Phil Brown, who is back by popular demand after presenting a webinar with us in June about the Jewish experience in the Catskills. In today's talk, Phil focuses on the important haven that the Catskills represented for Jews during and after World War II. Before we get started, I do want to make a few notes about this webinar. All of you in the audience will be muted throughout. If you have questions during Phil's presentation or afterward, please type them into the questions panel to the right of your screen, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes, so please bear with us if there are any technological hiccups or distractions, and we thank you in advance for your patience. Even if we lose the connection or if you miss something on your end, you'll have access to the full recording of this session afterward. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Phil Brown is founder and president of the Catskills Institute, an organization that works to record and remember the history of the Catskills through conferences, lectures, and the world's largest archive of Catskills items. Phil is the author of 3 books about the Jewish experience of the Catskills, and for 13 years in a row, he ran an annual conference on the history of the Catskills. More recently, he is focused on the experience of the Holocaust and immediate period afterward in the region, which he began to explore while serving on the advisory board for the film Four Seasons Lodge, a documentary about a bungalow colony created by and for Holocaust survivors. Phil Brown is also University Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Health Sciences at Northeastern University, where he directs the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute and is on the executive committee of the Jewish Studies program. Please join me in welcoming Phil Brown.
We're not going to play the music because we seem to have a glitch with it, but you were going to be hearing the song V'yahin Zolachgein, and it's a song that was written during the Holocaust, and it was widely sung in the Catskills. And the words show you that it's the plaint of where can I go? Tell me where can I go? There's no place I can see where to go, where to go. Every door is closed to me. To the left, to the right, it's the same in every land. There is nowhere to go, and it's me who should know. Won't you please understand? This song was a constant favorite in the Catskills, a song beginning in the woe of living in Nazi Europe and a hope for a new life in the promised land, whether in the modest casinos, entertainment halls, not gambling casinos, of small hotels, or the nightclubs of larger ones. The singers of every level of fame pounded this one out in Yiddish and English. The song ends with a promise fulfilled in a post-Holocaust yishuv to become Israel in 1948. That was where they could go. And then the final verse is, now I know where to go, where my folk proudly stand. Let me go to that precious promised land. No more left, no more right. Lift your head and see the light. I am proud, can't you see? For at last I am free. No more wandering for me. They wandered not only to Israel, but to America. The year after the war ended, 1946, Holocaust survivors began to arrive here from displaced persons camp, while GIs returned from extended tours in occupied Europe. Some settled into jobs in the Catskills. Indeed, the first person I interviewed for my book, Catskill Culture, was sent to work in the Flagler Hotel by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And that same year, European Jews and Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East began to flee to the Yishuv. And then they would finally establish the State of Israel 2 years later. And that was the first glimmer of what would be my newest book, Summer Haven, which I'll talk about in a while. At the same time, Hashomer Hatzair, the youth guard, had Camp Shomria, and there were other labor Zionist and socialist Zionist camps set up in the Catskills, preparing Jews for aliyah to Israel. If you don't know about Hashomer, in 1936, they were among the vanguard of the Haganah, the Jewish self-defense organization. And in 1943, Mordecai Anilowitz, who was the head of the Warsaw branch of Hashomer, led the Warsaw Ghetto uprising against the Nazis. And after the war, Hashomer Hatzair members founded some 30 kibbutzim. The year 1946 was also significant because Jews began to vacation without guilt in the mountains, opening the floodgates of the golden era of the 50s and 60s, when over 1,200 hotels and bungalow colonies operated in what was then probably the world's largest resort area, with an estimated 500,000 people vacationing there annually. 1946 was also the year my parents bought the Royal Hotel in White Lake. The hotel would be foreclosed upon in only 6 years, and they would work as I would in other people's hotels all their lives and all of mine until graduate school. The longest duration job up till that time my mother had was a chef, 6 years in Seven Gables, and that was where I first learned about the Holocaust. Leon Uris's Exodus told the same story, the song we opened with, the creation of Israel. And in the 1958 publication, when I was 9 years old, left the entire hotel population talking about this book as they shared the few copies with each other. This kind of Catskills context was my primary Jewish education. Now, for those who didn't hear my prior talk for the Jewish Heritage Center, I would say a few words about the history. What began with the farmlands of mainly Ulster and Sullivan County, finally the year-round population of chicken and dairy farmers who had a hard time making a living on the poor soil, began to take in boarders, and eventually they made that their main enterprise. And of course, they advertised in Yiddish. By the way, if you read Yiddish, you'll see that much of this is translation. For example, Prospect Inn instead of Prospect Kretschmer, and Shana Moderna Rooms. Some boarding houses became kuchelanes, cook for yourselves, a room rented in a boarding house in which the kitchen and dining room was shared, and these facilities had maybe 10 to 40 guests. Kuchelanes frequently developed into bungalow colonies in which individual small cottages were rented out complete with kitchen. Some of these kuchelanes would later turn into hotels, although many hotels started directly from either farms or just as hotels. And the kuchelanes in the colonies provided a very familial milieu where people were together the entire summer, forming very close connections. Now, in the hotels, the owners, the guests, and the staff also knew each other, often coming from the same city neighborhoods. And the hotels acquired a local culture that continued into the rest of the year. Guests returned year after year and often from generation to generation. A child in the day camp might later be a waiter and return once again as a guest with the spouse and children. Staff guest romances were common. Some hotels and colonies were thoroughly Yiddishist, even into the 1960s. The best of these, best known, was the Greenfield's literary colony in Woodridge, which was a major center of Yiddish writers, including Isaac Bashevis Singer. The persistence of Yiddish speaking, of Yiddish-English patois, and of Yiddish jokes in the Catskills after the Holocaust was a form of resistance against the Nazi attempt to destroy Jewish life. So this gets us to Summer Haven. My co-author Holly Levitsky and I put the book together, and it's about the Catskills, the Holocaust, and the literary imagination. And that last phrase is because we present new and existing works of fiction and of memoir. We explore how vacationers, resort owners, workers, and local residents dealt with the horrific contradiction, the pleasure of the summer haven contrasted with the mass extermination of Jews. We took the opportunity to conduct more original research on the Holocaust and the immediate after period in the Catskills. And we asked each author or surviving relative to reflect on the significance of their work in hindsight. Now, if you look at the table of contents, you see we had very eminent writers involved. And it's nice to say that most of them, if they were alive, had spoken at one of our 13 conferences. we also had a contest for the best original fiction and the best original nonfiction, and we had the best scholars in the Jewish studies field who judged the nonfiction, and we had the best writers and novelists and short story writers judge the fiction. And these are found in the back of the book. We're very proud of them, and we certainly hope that you read them. So the Catskills was a summer haven for both survivors and for those who had arrived earlier, because Jews had always a fear of pogroms and of murder. Jews sought ways to release their rising fears and ongoing anxieties during and after the war years by engaging in community life while living beside the disaster. And the social climate of the mountains addressed the lighter side of life, an abundance of pleasures in the form of food, sex, music, dancing, and humor. And their words and feelings convey a longing to recapture the pre-Holocaust past, an incapacity to measure the immense loss caused by the Holocaust, a willingness to laugh and cry simultaneously, and an understanding of the human need for love and connection, even after such full-scale loss. Now, I was driven to this project because I always thought a lot about the Catskills experience in the Holocaust, as I mentioned for my first interview for the first book. But there were two main phenomena that really propelled me to do this. I was involved in the advisory board for the film Four Seasons Lodge, which is a beautiful documentary, as you heard in the introduction, of a colony owned and run by survivors. And I will say more about this, and I hope that you watch this beautiful film. The second factor was a deep appreciation of Reuben Wallenrod's novel, Dusk in the Catskills, which I read when I began my Catskills research in 1993. Other Catskills authors who I'll talk about dealt with the Holocaust, but Wallenrod portrayed this experience in a fashion unparalleled by others. But before we get to that, let's look at what people were doing in other hotels during this period. At Grossinger's in 1939, people were entertained by Willie the Lion Smith and Hot Lips Page. Now you see here, I'm pointing with this arrow, look who's playing Willie the Lion Smith. This was a very, very famous man. He was half Jewish, which you probably don't know for the most part. What you may know is he was one of the most famous stride pianists, and he was a key influence on Duke Ellington. He was born in Newark to a white Jewish father and a Christian mother who was of Black, Spanish, and Native American heritage, and he attended synagogue with his white Jewish neighbors. But while he listed Hebrew cantor and Yiddish-English on his business card and popularized the aforementioned aliyah for many Black singers who performed it, including Ethel Waters, Lionel Hampton, and Johnny Mathis, Smith shaped this as a standard cover for Black artists. In fact, he knew the melody in Yiddish diction so well that he corrected a performer who was singing Eli Eli with the Duke Ellington Band. You can read more about this in a June 2020 article in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency's Kveller.com by Ariel Kaplan. Smith had a very similar experience to Thomas LaRue, known as the Black Cantor, and the subject of a Forward article on August 1st, just 3 weeks or so ago. And it's a beautiful article called "In the 1920s, a Black Cantor Moved the World." So you think this is digression? Well, yes, but this talk gets me into interesting asides, and they really are relevant. But anyway, back on track. I had the pleasure of speaking with my friend Elaine Grossinger-Edis last week, and she and I had been very involved in helping organize a wonderful month-long Catskills festival at the Boca Raton JCC in 2018. She, I, and other speakers were there, and many films were shown, and there was a marvelous exhibit of hundreds of Catskill memorabilia. And Elaine recalled how, starting during the war, Grossingers began a tradition that lasted up until they closed, of making an annual fundraiser for the Jewish National Fund every Rosh Hashanah. What else were people doing during this time? At the Tempo Cottages, a young man prepared to leave for war. In 1941, the Zausner family gathered in front of the handball courts of their Nemerson Hotel in South Fallsburg. In 1942, Clarence Steinberg worked on his family's farm and would later co-author a great book on the history of the Jewish farmers in the Catskills with his colleague, Abe Lavender. In 1943, guests enjoyed themselves at the Wellworth Hotel in Hurleyville. We don't know exactly what they were thinking about in terms of the Holocaust, but the entertainers were as conscious as other Jews about what was happening overseas. Their acts often included jokes about the war. As Jake Ehrenreich points out, survivors cried at home and laughed in the Catskills. But unlike at other hotels, Wallenrod clearly had the Holocaust centrally in his mind during his wartime stint as a writer in residence at the real-life Rosenblatt Hotel in Glen Wild, later renamed the Coronet and later on the Empress. Beshert by fate, the village of Glen Wild, Rosenblatt's location, is linked to the very beginning of Catskills Jewish history. The first Jewish resort was started there in 1899 by John Gerson, and I was very fortunate to interview his granddaughter, Sylvia Ader. Gerson provided land for the Glen Wild Shul in 1912 and was built in 1923. Gerson had to know Louis Rosenblatt because the hotel hosted Wallenrod, and Rosenblatt was a charter member of that congregation. In the time between the 1913 incorporation of the shul and the 1923 construction and opening, the congregation met in the living room of Shimon Jaffe, the rabbinical student they got to come over and serve them. It was only 13 or so families of Glen Wild who had written home to their landslide in the shtetl of Novoalexandrovsk, later Zarasai, in Lithuania. Their first task as a congregation was to purchase land for a cemetery, and the first grave was dug in 1919 for a young mother who fell victim to the influenza pandemic that killed 50 million people worldwide in 1918 to 19. And what a strange juxtaposition for our pandemic a century later. Is this another digression? Not at all. It's really exploring how Wallenrod and his work about the Holocaust and the Catskills opens up doors to the entire history of the Catskills. When I interviewed Reb Shimon's sons, Abe and Dave Jaffe, in 1993, they spoke about how proud they were to have two Torahs in their house for services for 10 years until the shul was built across the road from them. And they still treasured the shul's huge ledger-sized minute book that they kept at their house. Abe's daughter, Naomi Jaffe, still owns that farm that her grandfather bought in 1919, 15 years after he arrived in Glen Wild in 1904, and where he raised poultry. And she thinks that some of their property is actually on the site of Gerson's boarding house. She gave me this 1944 photo of the Glen Wild honor roll plaque of the Glen Wild soldiers who served in the war. And there you have the women of the Glen Wild Women's Club standing and sitting in front of it. And it's on the front lawn of Rosenblatt's hotel, clearly visible in the background. And this links the GI sacrifice to fight Nazism with the historical importance of the hotel. Wallenrod's eloquent juxtaposition of genocide and pleasure made for jarring yet necessary understanding. But more than that, Wallenrod told his story over the entire season of the Rosenblatt Hotel, from pre-season preparation all the way to post-season closing down. In the process, he recorded the life not just of a hotel, but of a people. He wrote this in Hebrew between 1941 and 1944, and it was published in 1946 as Kifan Yom, which literally means because the day turns. He translated himself into the English, and the Reconstructionist Press published it in 1957. Now, Wallenrod was unlike the Yiddishists who were so common throughout the Catskills. He left Belarusia for Israel in 1920 and then came to the U.S. 3 years later. He was part of the Jewish nationalists, also called the Hebraists, and they felt that modern Hebrew was the way to go rather than Yiddish. He was an accomplished novelist, a great literary critic, and had a number of books published on Hebrew literature. I was fortunate to meet and speak with his daughter, Naima Privats, and she gave lots of information to us to fill in about his life and work. And she wrote a wonderful appreciation of him and a commentary on the book in our Summer Haven volume. And she recalled that in the same year, 1955, the English translation was published, and so was Herman Wouk's Marjorie Morningstar, which was first a successful novel and then a movie in 1958. And Naima remembers discussions about Reuben Wallenrod's portrayal of the Catskills and the value of his work in contrasting that to Wouk including his concern for the assimilation that Luke portrayed and that Wallenrod felt was dangerous to Judaism. There was very serious consideration of making Dusk in the Catskills into a Broadway play. Herman Wouk's novel, as you know, does center around the rebellion of Marjorie Morningstar, which is the Anglicization of Morgenstern, against her father's traditional expectations of her future life as a Jewish wife and mother. She awakens to love and sexuality in the fictional Southwind adult camp in the Catskills, where she falls in love with Noel Ehrman, nay, Ehrman. Wallenrod was always critical of the sexuality and escapism that many Catskills guests brought, and because there was a push to transform Dusk in the Catskills into a sexier presentation, he wasn't willing to make those changes. The book follows hotel owner Leo Halper over the course of one full year, from the end of one summer season to the following autumn, and during this period the U.S. has entered the war in Europe. Halper, like Wallenrod, is a Jewish immigrant from Eastern Europe, and he feels acutely and painfully aware of the atrocities happening to the Jews in Europe. At the same time, he loves his little Brookville hotel and the beauty of the Catskills landscape. The book is prophetic in its mixing of past, present, and future tenses to unfold the terrible story of the destruction of European Jewry. Wallenrod provides a clue to his prophetic role in the opening epigraph from Jeremiah. Woe unto us, for the day declineth, for the shadows of the evening are stretched out. Now, interestingly, this epigraph exists only in the English version, written after the war, and seems to send a warning back in time. And the idea of warning one's flock is a leading feature of a writer's mission to his people, to his nation, and to the surrounding world. And so Dusk in the Catskills stands, like Jeremiah, a prophet's lamentation for the suffering. As a small hotel owner, Leo Halper has many bills to pay and fewer visitors to his small hotel, and he fears he may lose it. In conversation with his wife and family, he worries that the world of the Jewish Catskills is fading, and that many immigrant writers and artists who depend upon him every season will lose that community. But the larger worry that grows within him, hidden from others, is the Holocaust, the horrifying details about which he comes to know more and more during the course of the novel. He obsesses over the destruction of European Jewry, to which he feels existentially connected, and he's roused to an almost feverish state of anxiety over this helplessness. He remembers fondly his early years on that European landscape, a setting not unlike the Catskills. He remembers himself as a boy running in the fields and swimming in the ponds of the old country, where many of his relatives remain. And while these memories of his youth crowd his mind, he muses about the young people dancing in his hotel. The heart knows well that there is another great, wide, threatening world outside you, but you are afraid to stop your dancing and think of that world. Such knowledge may well break up the charm of the circle. It may well break up your very being, all of you. Halper refers both to the others and himself with the pronoun you, carrying the tone of either a sermon or a rabbinical blessing or a command. And he's like the leader of a congregation bearing responsibility for his people. And he believes that they may not know what is best or how to act or how to see this deep catastrophe underlying the Holocaust. And among his greatest concerns is what to do with that knowledge of the atrocities. Like other Jews, he donates to the Jewish National Fund and other sources willingly to help the new Israeli refugees and to help resettlement. In his inner monologues, he struggles with feelings of satisfaction in being amidst the lake and mountains. But as soon as he feels grateful to have escaped the bleakness and death, fear and torture, he feels shame for being safely away. He's frustrated at not being able to help his family and friends in Europe. And as Wallenrod writes, he was gnawed by the thought that he and Lillian, his wife, were hiding here between the mountains in a sheltered den. There, across the mountains, terrible things were going on. People were being driven with whips in the cold and wind. Little children stood helplessly on the side of the road like forsaken sheep. And near them and from above them came fearful shrieks from the storm. And he, Leo Halper, was hiding here between the walls of his house in the Catskill Mountains. It was awesome and shamefully pleasant in the shelter. And Halper goes on to capture his experiences. People hid behind frost-covered windows, warmed their hands on iron stoves, and listened to the sounds coming from the radio. The sounds seemed to come from the storm. The window panes trembled. The trees hummed. The voices on the radio told of terrible storms across the mountains and oceans. There, people fled in terror, hid in snow pits. Men and women left the houses in which they lived all their lives and ran like frightened animals. There, across the mountains and the oceans, wild beasts laughed and mocked and threatened. And here, a man sat and listened to the radio. Wallenrod lost his father, sister, and her 2 children in the Holocaust. His book honors their memory, even as it closely examines through the loneliness of Leo Halper, the terrible crisis of being removed from one's family as they face their death. And though tortured by an inability to act, his memories become a blessing, a monument to those people and places. Halper's thoughts are private memory, but the book is shared in public and openly expresses sorrow and sympathy in its lamentation. Nobody tackled the subject as deeply as Wallenrod. I think you can hear from what I told you and quoted from him. But many writers have dealt with the Catskills and the Holocaust and the immediate period after, focusing on themes of nostalgia, loss, humor, and sexuality. And the great I.B. Singer, in his 1972 novel Enemies: A Love Story, has considerable time in the Catskills addressing the incapacity to imagine the extent of the Holocaust. And in the story, we learn about the impossibility of life returning to normal for the survivors. And yet, even with knowledge of such loss and in the face of fractured lives, there is humor, love, sexuality, and always the search for a haven from that knowledge. Harvey Jacobs' 1975 novel, Summer on a Mountain of Spices, is even more focused on sexuality as it romps through the lives of the owners and guests at a small family hotel during the final 2 weeks of World War II. The characters' longings and desires are played out amid an abundance of sex and humor as a haven against the war. The lustiness and the earthiness of the landscape builds to an enormous celebration on the day the war ends. In Martin Boris's novel, Woodridge, 1946, it's more about the returning GIs than the survivors who struggle to find their place after the horrors of the war. Eileen Pollock's novel, Paradise, New York, reminds us that each hotel, even into the 1960s, had people with numbers on their arms. And in her novel, the hotel gives discounts out of compassion. Central to her book is her notion that the Catskills was a refuge for what was best about the culture that Hitler tried to destroy, exemplified in the dignity and grace embodied by those Jews who remained faithful to each other along with what was best in their culture and their religion. And oh, those numbers could come alive. Hal Bookbinder wrote me 10 years ago and reminded me yesterday about an incident at his family's hotel, Bookbinders, which they ran for only a few years, from 1959 to 1961. As a busboy just entering his teen years, he saw a woman walk into the dining room, and from across the room came a gasp and a shout. Another woman jumped up from her table and ran across to embrace the woman who went to the dining room. The two had been best friends as girls in Poland, and both went to a death camp where they last saw one another. Both assumed the other had perished. This was quite an emotional scene in which everyone participated. And as Hal wisely pointed out, I'm sure this was repeated any number of times in resorts in the Catskills. Art Spiegelman's mouse, too, spends much time in the Catskills, with his father Vladek getting a calming distraction from the constant traumatic memories he carries like a second skin. Being in the Catskills for him gives some sense of autonomy over his increasingly chaotic life. Joe Berger's memoir, Displaced Persons, Growing Up American After the Holocaust, is a love story to his survivor parents. They experienced immeasurable loss, worked tirelessly after the war to start a family and reestablish a home. And while he chronicles the immense loss suffered by his parents and others, he also honors the refuge of the mountains that offered an opportunity for survivors to carve out new lives for themselves and their children. After her arrival, Lilo Leeds and her mother bought a small hotel for about 40 people in Tannersville in the northern Catskills, and they started Lilo's Lodge, either 1947 or 1948, and they ran it until about 1970. The clientele was largely German Jews, and they advertised in the Aufbau, a New York paper for German Jews printed in German. Interestingly, Yiddish was not spoken there. English was spoken, very little German. For those of you who might remember Abraham Kahan's book, they don't like to speak Yiddish in the German Jewish Catskills. Lilo's son reports that people were eager to not talk about the Holocaust and told me, quote, "My cousin reports a man with a number tattooed on his arm, tells him it's so he won't forget his phone number." Thane Rosenbaum's short story, Bingo by the Bungalow, is also a haven, but seems more chaotic. Rosenbaum shows us cones where, quote, an entire colony was filled with crazies. It was a summer loony bin of refugees from the fallen Europe now resettled in America, spending the months of June through August in Sullivan County. And as he calls the people, they were each a survivor from one camp or another, Bergen-Belsen, Majdanek, Treblinka, Auschwitz. They were safe here, well, as safe as they could ever allow themselves to feel. And Kohn spits on Hitler's face with the colony's entrance sign, Kohn Summer Cottages, Leisure macht frei. So this brings us to the idea of a whole colony of survivors. A number of survivors had shared summers at a larger bungalow colony, but by the 1970s felt uncomfortable among non-survivors, and they felt they didn't understand the constant talk about the Holocaust. They moved around from colony to colony, but the most recent place for them had been Cutler's, a very large place in South Fallsburg. But as I say, they didn't understand, others didn't understand their talk. So they bought an old colony that was part of the Hotel Excelsior, and they turned it into a survivor-only colony. As you see on the upper left photo, a number of hotels also did run these adjoining bungalow colonies, like the Evans Kayamisha, where my mother was once a chef. The better facilities and the entertainment in hotels were a big draw for bungalow renters because the colonies couldn't usually afford that same level of facilities. And the Four Seasons was a place of refuge. It was a place where people gathered together and created their own new culture. And you see some of these old slides here first of what the Excelsior was like, and then in the next slide you see some of the colony that became Four Seasons Lodge and some of the folks who lived there. These people had a great social life. They were very, very eager to dress up well at night. They had services. They had wonderful entertainment at night. And they wanted to dress up. Even though bungalow colony people were very informal, they put on fine dresses and suits and ties to dance together. And they always said, everybody should come together. We shouldn't just invite the next door bungalow to our bungalow. We shouldn't just talk to those people or these people. We should all be together. And they did it. They made a beautiful colony where they could daven together. They made a colony where they could hug each other, where they could talk about the Holocaust. And in these next slides, you see some beautiful photos of what life was like for them. A very small, modest casino where they had bar stools and could get a drink or a snack. And then looking in the next slide, you see dancing and hugging, something very important to them, to always be together. Having a place with land aplenty and the freedom to live on it, that, like they in this set of photographs in the Four Seasons Lodge, that was a long-standing Jewish dream. And Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was the Jewish heart, the liturgy, the literature, and the folk life for millennia. And there are parallels between the return to Israel and the move to the Catskills. While the kibbutzniks would make the desert bloom and grow food to support themselves and their whole society, Jewish farmers in the Catskills would try to do something similar. They weren't as successful beyond milk and eggs, but they built a very, very strong Jewish-centered culture from the 1890s onward. And it was in their farmhouses that the first boarding houses started. And we were fortunate to have, as you saw on that previous slide, two of the colony's leaders and the film director, Andrew Jacobs, speak with us at the Catskills conference. And they told us in beautiful words what it was like to create this colony and to make it survive. So these are resorts and villages, as you see in the next slide, served by synagogues, beautiful synagogues, very, very modest, but often architectural wonders, many of them on the National Register of Historic Places. And there were Jewish schools and Jewish tradespeople and merchants. In the next slide, you see cultural institutions like the Workmen's Circle, the Jewish Agricultural Society, the Farmers Co-op, the Insurance Co-op. The Jews in the Catskills created their own sort of a promised land, their own land of milk and honey, their own place of safety. I wrote 5 short stories about the Catskills, one of which is called The Catskills Muse, and it's in Summer Haven. Another story, though, The Boss's Guest, recounts the relationship between a distressed hotel owner and an unexpected guest who ultimately shows him that his hotel is his home, is his family, and that land is really the Jerusalem of his heart. And my intent in the boss exploring this with his guest and becoming more compassionate, more open, more loving, my intent was to locate the realization in his heart. But in retrospect, it's the symbolism of return to Jerusalem and really to the whole land of the Catskills. After the masses of immigrants came between the 1890s and 1920s, and when the survivors came in the 1940s, they built in the United States the largest Jerusalem outside of Israel, and they built their own mini Jerusalem in the Catskills. Like the whole Golden Medina, the golden land of the United States, the Catskills would be a place where the Nazis could never threaten Jews again. No wonder there were Zionist training camps to prepare people for making aliyah to Israel. The safety of the Catskills helped to shape the safety of the post-Holocaust state of Israel. As a child, teenager, and young adult, I saw this vacation diaspora as endless and timeless, always to be there as an immense presence with joyous memories. To grow into adulthood and watch it disappear was a great loss, though that loss is what propelled me to become its chronicler. I quoted earlier Wallenrod's epigraph from Lamentations that sets the stage for his book. Woe unto us, for the day declineth, for the shadows of the evening are stretched out. For a hotel keeper, Leo Halper, this was the fear of the end of his hotel ownership and, writ larger, of the whole Catskills, the latter which was just not ready to happen that early. And we can look farther to the end of the Jewish people as a threat that always was with us. And remember that Lamentations is Jeremiah's mourning poetry about the destruction of the temple. How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become a widow, she that was great among nations and princess among the provinces? How is she become tributary? She weepeth sore in the sight, and her tears are on her cheeks. She hath none to comfort her among all her lovers. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies. After the temple is destroyed comes exile and always the age-old hope for return. The Catskills is part of that repatriation. As I and others memorialize its legacy, photograph its ruins, collect its mementos, and mine the memories of its players, we celebrate the summer haven we hope to always share. I rejoice in its return. Thank you.
Phil, thank you so much for that really fascinating and poignant presentation. Before we get to questions from the audience, I do want to mention that the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center is planning a rich year ahead of online learning opportunities. So we encourage you to sign up to receive event notices and other news from the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at jewishheritageCenter.org/join us. Now let's turn to some of your questions. Please, again, type any questions or comments you have into the questions panel to the right of your screen. Several questions and comments did come in during the presentation. Well, let me just start with one thing I wanted to follow up on, Phil. You mentioned at one point that it was said that we cried at home but laughed in the Catskills. And I'd love you to talk a little bit more about the role of humor and what made it okay for people, what made it allowable for people to laugh and to enjoy themselves, and as you say, to experience pleasure in the Catskills.
Well, the literature and the experience of Jewish life in the worst of times, was always trying to be humorous. I mean, picture Fiddler on the Roof. God bless the Tsar and keep him far away.
Right.
You had a bad time. You had something that was suffering, and you turned it into something humorous because that protected you. Or one can think about the film. I can't remember the name. Where the family is in the concentration camp together, and the father pretends to the child that they're in a summer camp and protects him and shelters him, creates an alternative universe for him. We always tried to avoid that suffering. Humor was a good way to do it because humor was so ironic. Humor allowed you to get out all your deepest fears and your deepest hopes. And humor was just something that was really in Jewish culture. And so, yes, you could cry at home, but when you had a chance to get together in some entertaining, beautiful location with other people, also yearning for some hope and faith and liberation and joy, then you let it all out. And these Jewish comedians and dramatists and performers from Second Avenue Vaudeville came up there, and they started doing their shtick, and it became the whole centerpiece of all of American humor, not just Jewish humor. And that's the legacy that they brought with them, the notion that you could make humor out of anything, even if it was horrendous.
Right. That is a Jewish tradition, but it is remarkable even at that dark time that that humor was as strong and as appreciated as it was. Some comments here, a few people to the point about, finding humor in the midst of horror. Some people are mentioning the film Life is Beautiful, came
Yes.
out 20 years or so ago. So several people are asking about the book list of, they'd love the list of books that you have referenced in this talk. So we can follow up with folks, make sure there will be a chance to give comments when you leave the webinar, and we do ask if you don't mind taking just a few moments to fill out a brief survey, and you can ask in that, provide your email and ask in there for the book list, and we will send that on.
And let me also say, if you go to the Catskills Institute website, we have the book corner, which has little blurbs of dozens of books, many more than I could mention. I only picked ones to talk about here that dealt with this period, but there's a huge wealth of literature, both fiction and nonfiction. So you can have fun exploring all of that.
Indeed, and we do have on the screen right now the URL for the Catskills Institute, and there is a wealth of resources there. In fact, someone, Brian asks, my grandfather is Joseph Gutschmidt, and with his brother Max had a vaudeville act called the Novell Brothers, centered on a dog act and music. 1920 until the 1940s. They lived in New York. How can I find out if they performed in the Catskills and where? Is that the sort of thing that might be cataloged at the Catskills Institute, Phil, or do you have suggestions for how people can do further research?
The Catskills Institute has collected over a couple of decades are endless queries from people, and they write in things like that. And if somebody then writes and says, did you ever, see somebody here? Did you ever know this? People would write and say, at such and such a hotel, the owner used to sing a song to send my father to sleep. My father told me about this. He helped put him to sleep at night when he couldn't go to sleep. Any idea of how I could find anything? Could I get a postcard from that to send him for his 90th birthday? And if I find a match, I link those people up. So yeah, we make a shidduch of all sorts from some of these. We don't have cross references to many of the queries, but you'd be surprised how many things we were able to get. There are also lots of Facebook sites and reunion sites. So for people who went to a particular colony or a hotel, there often are Facebook groups and other social media groups for those folks. There used to be in Florida and South Florida a couple of different reunion conferences every year even. There was one in
Excellent.
the Catskills the summer before. They were going to have one this summer until the COVID crisis ended it.
Yes, I see that Leah is asking if there are still reunions held in the Catskills for descendants and descendants of survivors.
I don't think specifically for survivors, but I don't know. The Four Seasons Lodge does have a Facebook page, so there could be some discussion there about this. The reunion I mentioned from last summer, which was sometime in July, was actually the first one that was organized just by workers, by the busboys, waiters, counselors, etc.
So we have a personal question here. Phil, was your mother's name Rosie? And if so, I knew her.
My mother was Sylvia, and my
Sylvia.
father was William or Bill. And I lamented the fact that for many, many years I didn't, when she was alive, get her to put together Sylvia's Catskills cookbook, because all those dishes would have been wonderful. There are some Catskills cookbooks. There's, Jenny Grosinger's has one. And the Maple Court Hotel, a very small, wonderful place in Greenfield Park, also had a little cookbook. Never got as much play as the Grossinger's cookbook.
Several people are, and you did speak a bit to this in your last talk, which was a more general history of the Jewish experience in the Catskills, bringing the story farther forward. But several people are asking what happened to some of the bungalows and the hotels. Can you give us a quick recap of how the community evolved and eventually dispersed later in the 20th century?
I mean, at the risk of plugging my book, Catskills Culture, I've got a whole chapter on the decline of the Catskills, and there are so many reasons for it. And I won't go into that now. I'll simply say that virtually all the hotels are gone. A couple of the big ones, were recycled into big resorts, the Falls View and the Granite. But all the hotels were either torn down or burned down or just collapsed under their own weight. Bungalow colonies, which were a bunch of smaller buildings and didn't require that much, were easier to kind of move into, and people bought them, maybe expanded them, turned them into individual summer homes. A lot of Orthodox places developed, so you could bring a whole group from one sect up there, and you could have your own little mini yeshiva. You could have your own store that just sold what was, under that sect's own hechsher. So there are those places now. There's a lot of Orthodox places. There are surprisingly a few colonies that are secular, but you don't find the hotels. You find a lot of ruins. By the 1970s, most of the hotels were closing or already had closed, and certainly by the end of the 70s. So let's say we say that 1980 was the end. 40 years later, 4 decades, trees could be 30, 40, 50 feet tall. So you could be driving down roads, as I have, and you have to find some remnant on the street side, like an old little entrance post or something, to know that if you stopped there and walked in the woods, you would find an old hotel. And that was a great thing. And I took endless photographs by doing that. And there's a whole wonderful world out there of the ruins. But the Catskills, as we know it from these times, are gone. Some people have transformed little hotel buildings into private residences. And I did show some of those in the earlier presentation.
Terrific. Well, Bonnie is asking, she's saying that she loves books about the Catskills, and will you write more? Do you have any books in the works, Phil?
Well, I always say that the next one will be the Catskills on 5 meals a day. But I
Only
don't know.
five?
Only five. Um, no, the truth is, I told you I wrote 5 short stories and only got to publish this one. And I would love to find a way to publish those maybe someday. Um, I don't know if I'll do other writing, but putting together a talk like this enables me to delve deeper into some of the things that I did for Summer Haven, and I learned a lot more just in the last couple of months preparing this. So some of those segues like Willie the Lion Smith. I mean, there's a lot of fun things to find. So there may be more to come. I won't rule it out.
Well, keep us posted if you do. Couple more comments before our time is up. Cantor Murray Simon says, I am a retired cantor, and I know that there was a rich tradition of cantors officiating at Passovers and, Passover Sederim and the High Holy Days in the Catskills. You mentioned Willie the Lion, who mentioned that who promoted himself as a cantor. But are you familiar with the tradition of cantors moonlighting in the
Well,
Catskills?
so like today, a lot of people didn't want to kasher the house for Pesach, so they would go away. And now they do that in all parts of the world. But 50, 60 years ago, if you were going to go away for Pesach, you went to the Catskills. And so indeed, there were many hotels that had cantors there. So the most famous would be Richard Tucker. And there were very, very eminent cantors of all stripes there. In one of my presentations, I counterposed the very elegant Seder at Grossinger's with a very small Seder at a family hotel that's 20 times smaller than Grossinger's. And I have a photograph, I think it might be in one of my first 2 books, of the Hotel Gradus, where they have their advertisement for Passover. And, again, it tells you who's performing there. And Abe Taras and his orchestra. For those of you who know klezmer, Taras was one of the 2 main people who brought klezmer to America. So Passover in the Catskills was a very, very important part of the season, and so was Rosh Hashanah.
Wow, the questions and comments are flowing in, and we won't have a chance to get to all of them. I'm sorry to say. Just 1 or 2 more. One person. Let's see. Wow. Well, one person asks if there's this fascinating culture of summer vacation in the Catskills. One person asks, was that uniquely American? Because people coming from Eastern Europe and other parts of the world may not have had that concept of a summer vacation. So is that
It's
a
true.
sort of uniquely American phenomenon as well?
It was very American. One reads of wealthier Jewish families in the old country who could go away, but where could they go? Probably not a lot of Jewish resorts, and it was pretty hard to go as a Jew to a resort in Europe, just like it was in the Catskills before they started having Jewish hotels and bungalow colonies there. And people didn't have time, and most Jews were relatively poor or modest, and they couldn't get away. And in many parts of Europe, in the Pale of Settlement, they couldn't travel. So it was a very unique thing, to come to this country, to live more freely, and to be able to travel wherever you wanted. And if you landed in New York, nobody told you couldn't go to Nashville and start a haberdashery store. No one told you couldn't go to St. Louis and open up a restaurant. And these people, they didn't have vacations for the most part in the old country. So this was a new thing for them. And it was very inexpensive. If you went to a kuchelein, if you went to a boarding home, and even to a small hotel, it was really very inexpensive. And for a few $100s, you get a whole summer of a bungalow in the 1950s.
Terrific. Well, one last comment, and I do apologize to those of you whom we couldn't get to, but please do send your inquiries and comments and your memories and memorabilia to the Catskills Institute .northeastern.edu, and you can email Phil directly, p.brown@neu.edu. I think we should close on Robin's comment, the Catskills forever in my heart. Thank you, Phil. So thank you from all of us, and thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us today. Thank you for your patience at the top of the program as we're dealing with technical difficulties, but I'm sure you agree that it was well worth the wait. As I mentioned earlier, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a brief survey as you leave the webinar, and we really appreciate your feedback, which helps us develop further programming. I also want to mention that this free webinar was made possible by contributions to the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center and to New England Historic Genealogical Society from people all over the world. Please consider making a donation of your own to help us create more free programs like this one. And to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center, please visit our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. We hope to see you again at other webinars this fall and over the winter. Until then, we wish you a very happy summer's end, and for those of you celebrating next month, a happy Jewish New Year. Thank you.